Welcome back to day 2 of the International Lyallpur History Conference 2024. We will begin our day with our second plenary session, the methodological diversity to understand the regional history. This session will explore the diverse methodology used to uncover the complex layers of regional history, from archival research to oral history, cultural and literary analysis, and much more. Our esteemed panelists will discuss how these approaches reveal unique insights into the past. This panel features another distinguished lineup of speakers. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. First of all, I want to invite Professor Perviz Vandal. He is an architect and founded the Trust of History of Arts and Agriculture in Pakistan, THAP. He is recipient of the Commonwealth Association of Architects. He is a co-author of the Raj, Lahore and Bhai Ram Singh. He is an editor, THAP Journal, and a professor at the University of Engineering and Technology, Lahore. Now, I would like to introduce another wonderful scholar, Dr. Yaqoob Bangesh. Dr. Yaqoob Bangesh is a historian of modern South Asia. His research interests lie in the emergence of Pakistan as a post-colonial state with broader interest in decolonization. Currently, he is a Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, IT University, Lahore. Sir, I request you to please join us on the stage. Dr. Bangesh was also the director of the Punjab Archives digitalization project, which aimed to make accessible the vast archives in Punjab. Our next speaker for the plenary session is a wonderful scholar, Professor Dr. Pippa Virdee. She is a professor of modern South Asian history at De Montfort University, Leicester, UK. She is serving as head of Department of History. Her research interests include British colonial history, the history of Punjab, and the South Asian diaspora. Welcome, Dr. Pippa Virdee. Her recent articles included Women and Pakistan, International Airlines in Ayub Khan's Pakistan, from Mano Majra to Fakir Wala, and a short introduction to Pakistan, a book published from Oxford University Press. Now, I would like to invite the session chair and the keynote speaker for day 2 and the plenary session, Professor Pashura Singh from University of California, Riverside. Professor Dr. Pashura Singh is a distinguished professor and Dr. J.S. Saini Chair in Sikh and Punjab Studies at the University of California, Riverside. He has a sound knowledge of traditional Sikh learning, manuscripts in arching form of Gurmukhi script and Indian religious tradition, with a mastery of contemporary issues in textual studies. He is the author of 4 Oxford monographs, including Life and Work of Guru Arjan, which was on the bestsellers list in India. He has edited or co-edited 9 volumes, including the Oxford Handbook of Sikh Studies. Please welcome Professor Dr. Pashura Singh.
Distinguished audience, Assalamu alaikum, Sat Sri Akal. Before I start the panel, I want to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference. I have organized 15 international conferences at the University of Michigan, 5 there, and 10 conferences at University of California, Riverside. But the most wonderful thing I have learned here, it's wonderfully organized, and all the organizers are, doing their job in a very efficient manner. I would like to thank Mr. Zukar Nanji for supporting the academic programs. This is a wonderful thing because you are preparing a new generation of scholars, and the more scholars you produce, they will contribute to the society, and it will be an asset to the government of Pakistan. Finally, I would like to say that the conference convener is a tough taskmaster. She will not give you even one extra minute. So please don't count this time as part of our panel. So let's come to the serious point now. Much of the debate in Punjab historiography has revolved around the questions raised by positivist historians trained under the influence of post-Enlightenment modernity. They have consistently maintained that history and documentation could prove a single line of causality in establishing the genealogy of past events. Their constant struggle with available sources could prove a singular methodology as relevant to scholarly inquiry, which can be identified as historical teleology. Recent scholarship firmly maintains that historical facts do not lead to one story, but rather to the interpretation of such facts to create various versions of history and therefore critical histories. The discipline of historiography is constantly changing, and scholars now maintain that in academic discourse, there must be an attempt to keep in sight the multiple and stratified representations of the past to preserve the folds and layers of production that join the past and the present. The framework of regional history must include alternative histories reflecting diverse methodological approaches. The basic concept of this panel is based on the premise that understanding regional history requires a diverse range of methodologies, each offering unique insights and ways to uncover the past. The choice of method depends on the nature of the sources available, the specific questions being asked, and the context of the region under study. In this panel discussion, we are interested to explore under what conditions archival, material culture studies, oral, cultural, and literary analysis, quantitative and other qualitative research methods can be employed. We are also interested in how the author's positionality, shaped by their class, ideology, gender, and race, can significantly influence how history is written and interpreted, and how to overcome the challenges of the positionality. We are keen to understand that whether a balance between objectivity and subjectivity can be possible, and if so, how the particular choice of research method can help in this regard. It should be emphasized that history is not simply the past. Rather, history is a dynamic process. To understand history is to understand movement, forward over time, diachronically, or in time, synchronically. The distinction between oral and written narratives does not relate to their relative truth, but their presentation of temporality. The one in a synchronic or atemporal frame of reference of time out of time, and the other in a fundamentally diachronic, linear frame of temporal sequence and relation. An historical account of anything that separates out its elements and traces each back to its source is not so accurate a description of what really happened as is one that looks at the same facts but the other way around and makes intelligible the historical process by which these disparate items from here and there were at a given moment creatively put together to constitute something new. Thus, we need to expand the range of questions we ask in historical analysis. What claims are contestants making about what really happened or is happening? From their perspectives, what forces, powers, or agents had the power to act in a particular situation? Who and what caused things to turn out as they eventually did? The answers to these questions may provide different historiographical narratives based upon contesting views of the past. In South Asian studies, we find this kind of revisionist historiography in The Hollow Crown by Nicholas Dirks and Textures of Time by Rao, Schulman, and Subramaniam. These authors have adopted a different approach than what the positivist historians did objectively with South Asian history. Most instructively, history and memory are as much about repression and suppression as they are about creation and recollection. In fact, the control of voices on historical knowledge has always been critical and remains critical in all sorts of settings. As David William Cohn remarks in his Decoming of History, this processing of the past in societies and historical settings all over the world, and the struggles for control of voices and texts in innumerable settings which often animate the processing of the past, this we term the production of history. Accordingly, postmodern historiography is based on Cohn's highly personal account of the social construction of memory and his dismissal of the possibility of objective knowledge of the past. He argues that meaning itself is highly unstable. For him, the production of history is a continuing process. Stories that different groups of people tell themselves about their own histories spring initially from contesting interpretations advanced by the participants themselves, those who claim to have witnessed an event. Over time, however, meanings shift as various parties assume authority to reinterpret surviving texts, and as they do so, they inevitably silence some voices, privilege others, and force bits of remembered experience into categories serving the interest of specific classes and institutions. In constructing regional history, oral history plays an important role in the absence of written documents about the past. Oral history is linked with a tradition which is generally understood as that which is handed down from the past. Although its nature is complex, it's much more than the passive conserving of information. As a matter of fact, tradition is the active enlivening of the present through links with the past. But central to the concept of tradition is memory, especially group memory, passed down through the generations. In particular, the concept of group memory has found increasing currency among historians and anthropologists and in the mass media. This concept conveys the dynamic aspect of narration, which is never just a recollection, but also the act of recollecting. Calendars count years, but narratives serve to describe the link between the past and the present. Motivated by shared interest in the past, groups derive roughly consensual group memories from individual memories. Successive groups shape and reshape those memories intersubjectively through discourse and may communicate versions to successive generations. As group interests change, so can the narratives that reflect them. In other words, group memories vary according to specific strategies of authorization, verification, and transmission that are deliberately adopted to express specific interests. It is interesting to note that group memories frequently offer different narratives of the past. Recognizing the fragility of memory, one may well wonder about the authenticity of histories constructed out of what people were called upon to remember. Thus, there is an urgent need to interrogate the motivations of the authors creating documents at a particular time and place. The rationale behind postmodern historiography is that it sees itself as exposing the working of power in history by showing how rhetorical forms are turned to political ends. This requires moving away from dubious authority of received tradition and consulting sources not typically well represented in surviving documentation, the most important and the most fragile being human memory. In aid of this, postmodernist historians seek to initiate lines of investigation to produce counter memories that will weaken what they regard as a hegemonic stranglehold on sources. They strongly argue that this will lead to alternative pathways to the past that will expose previously unsuspected worlds. They further claim that these counter memories have been suppressed by the unnamed but sinister hegemonic forces, presumably the establishment. It is necessary to evaluate the nature and scope of available documents, including the complex nature of historical context in which they were produced. In historical analysis, therefore, one must practice modesty as a supreme ethical virtue, discreetly holding in abeyance his or her own beliefs, prejudices, and presuppositions. It should, however, be emphasized that it's not entirely possible for any historian to be absolutely free from any preconceived intention. At times, one might not be aware of one's own unconscious subjectivity. Therefore, the goal of the historian should always be to utilize the rigors of investigation based on the principle of truth and detachment, and to offer no more than tentative claims based on historical probability. Indeed, true scholarship aspires to do no more. The nature of historical knowledge is always limited by the character and extent of evidence and can be altered by the discovery of new evidence or by the development of new methods of analyzing data. There is an urgent need to adopt a careful strategy for producing a substantial piece of historical writing from documentary traces of the past. In the process, we must address several questions crucial to the craft of the historian. What counts as documentary source? What are the cultural practices and social contexts in which the document is embedded? How do historians analyze and use sources? How do they build an interpretive framework and create a coherent and meaningful narrative from what was inevitably fragmentary materials? A careful attention to these questions will go a long way in the production of knowledge of the subject under investigation. Mostly, written documents emerge from the struggle of memory against forgetting. Certain issues are related to the complexity of the idea of forgetting and the power of silence. The powerful erase those out of power from the public consciousness through the deliberate process of forgetting and forge the collective memory that they select. Thus, all ancient documents were written on behalf of the victors, not from the perspective of the vanquished. Again, feminist scholars have strongly argued that since women have not generally been historians or recorded their own history, historical accounts have been presented only through the viewpoint of the male gender, and that what was and is important to men thus becomes the focus of historical analysis. It's no wonder that until recently, women's issues and achievements have been completely forgotten or deliberately ignored in major historical accounts. The same process of forgetting in historical writings has affected the subaltern and marginal groups of the society around the world. In this context, Michel Rolfe Trulier's provocative books, Silencing the Past, Power, and the Production of History, provides us with an insightful analysis in which power operates, often invisibly, at all stages in the making of history, to silence certain voices. History is not simply the recording of facts and events, but a process of actively enforced silences, some unconscious, others quite deliberate. Accordingly, silences are necessarily embedded within history. One cannot recount everything. Narratives require silence. At times, knowledge of the past becomes a dangerous thing, and its proponent maintains a determined silence for the sake of survival. This is how people conceal the past to protect themselves from reprisals. Again, those who want to advance their own agenda in their writings consciously remain silent about the role of other human actors. Any kind of historical analysis must allow the multiplicity of voices throughout history to be heard without privileging any singular one. There is an urgent need to explore new ways of knowing the past and to complement historical data with ethnographic study that can illuminate the lived experience of people of a region. In addition to documentary evidence, we must pay attention to material culture sources, artifacts of all sorts, as we try to make sense of the cultural context of a region. Moreover, different communities create memory through the practice of rituals and symbols. In fact, rituals and recitals could bridge the gap between the past and the present, where recitals of the past events are not just matters of intellectual exercises, but of an invocation and an evocation in which historical remembrances produce subjectivities and create mentalities. Finally, dialogical readings of primary sources, along with sectarian literature, can enable us to develop a more dynamic historical understanding of the past. Overall, considered historical judgment based on a nuanced assessment of the often contradictory evidence must form the bedrock of any historical analysis. Let me make the final point of decolonizing the production of knowledge. Regional history is fluid. With its interpretations and meanings, changing in the hands of the person narrating the history. It is a field stuck in its colonial legacy, with most common reading happening within imperial legacies. With the idea of objective history, the imperial legacies are constantly passed down, continuing to harm native religious communities or subaltern groups, as the history is seen as completely static once its narrative has been decided by its historians. The colonizers used the powerful tool of objective history to control their so-called uncivilized subjects. Sheldon Pollock has forcefully argued that when Western scholars claim that they understand the non-Western texts better than the interpreters from the cultures that produce the text due to their scientific objectivity, their claim to objectivity is itself deeply subjective and arises from an ideology of Western domination. It is, however, instructive to note that this ideology remains invisible to those who are enmeshed in it, since it's part of the very structure of the system of knowledge in which scholarship takes place. Accordingly, Western scholarship on text often speaks from a position of ideological power, a position that must be recognized. Reacting against this kind of intellectual colonialism based on European epistemological hegemony, some scholars are as harsh as to recommend that a true history cannot exist at all, while others suggest alternative methods to help decolonize historical knowledge, such as doing ethnography in the archive, deconstructing historical documents, or completely exiting the Western epistemes and constructing ethical realms of producing knowledge. Let me now conclude with some guiding questions which might be helpful to navigate the conversation between the panelists. The key questions of this plenary sessions are, number one, what sort of methodological tool we can employ to understand the regional history? Second, what methods are most beneficial when we study a region where primary documented sources are scarce or biased? Third, how the oral history can be beneficial in writing the regional history? Fourth, what challenges are facing researcher related to researcher positionality with respect to ideology, class, gender, race, and so on, while writing a regional history? Finally, can the regional history be written in an objective manner, or subjectivity is the key essential? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Pashura Singh, for a very wide-ranging keynote that I think has contextualized the whole debate here. And of course, I should also give a thank you to the organizers, especially Dr. Khola Chima and Dr. Tawheed Chattha Chima. I had to say it. Didn't forget. So what I'm going to say in the next couple of minutes is trying to be provocative which of course means that I don't completely agree with all what I'm saying, but these are questions that I think one must think about. And I think that's a very important consideration, because a lot of what we study in history now is affected by so many methodological issues, as Dr. Pashura Singh has spoken about, but also very many ideological issues. And by the end of it, we have really lost track of a lot of what and how history is done and understood. So I think we really need to ask some very serious and tough questions and then kind of move on from there to really understand how we can take the discipline forward, especially within the context of regional history. So I shall make just a few points, and then perhaps that could hopefully lead to a good discussion. The first thing that I really want to talk about is from where Dr. Pashura Singh ended, about can there be objective history? You know, can you study history in an objective manner, or that subjectivity is key? That reminded me of a quotation by, so to speak, the Baba of historiography, E.H. Carr. There's always an E.H. Carr quote. Think of a topic and there's an E.H. Carr quote. So E.H. Carr said, "The facts speak only when the historians call on them. It is he who decides to which facts to give to the floor and in what order or context." So there is a great, you know, and there's another a place where E.H. Carr, in What is History, his seminal work, speaks about the idea of facts being fish at a fishmonger's table. And it's really how you kind of bring it together. So the idea of subjectivity is always there, and it can never be taken out of it. That is why there are different books on history, or else there'll just be one book. You know, that's kind of History 101, which I teach my students, that if it is not subjective, the person is lying, because it just has to be. So I think that's a very key element. And in that sense, one needs to be very vigilant of the fact that when you do regional history, why are you interested in a particular region? Because there's always a subjectivity to it. You might be from the region. Your parents are from the region. You're married to someone from the region. You want to marry someone from the region. You know, there can be 100 combinations and permutations of this, but the subjectivity is key, and that's really important to understand. Related to that is my second point, and again, an E.H. Carr quote is always important. E.H. Carr says, "Study the historian before you begin to look at the facts." And that's a very, very important thing. We've lost track of who is writing history. We look more at what the text is, who's writing it, who's producing it. Where is it being produced? Those are very important and essential questions. What kind of a person is producing it? And I think, again, taking the author kind of in the back side of it, you know, that's one of the things that when I teach a course in research methodology, I always ask the students that whatever book they pick, first research about the historian. You know, who is the person? What background did they come from? Why are they talking about certain things? And, you know, I'm very happy that this conference is dedicated to the memory of K.K. Aziz Saab. I met him a couple of times, and once I kind of jokingly said to him that you wrote this very famous book, Murder of History, but you were very much a part of it. And he kind of like laughed at that, and he said, well, that's why I knew what to write. So again, you know, you need to understand which background the historian comes from, and I think that must remain center stage. And one must really kind of understand about that. The third thing that I really want to emphasize, and again, this is slightly controversial, but therefore I'm going to say it because, you know, one needs to kind of say some things that make you think beyond the normal. That a historian, and especially when you work on things like regional history, needs to be a historian. Now, what do I mean by that? There are reasons why there are different disciplines. In a world of interdisciplinarity and, you know, lots of conversations between different disciplines, if you forget which discipline you are in, then you'll never be faithful to what that discipline calls you to do. I'll take a different example here, you know, to illustrate the point. A few weeks ago, I was at an interreligious dialogue event. And one person said very clearly that, you know, at that event there were Muslims and there were Hindus and there were Christians and Sikhs and everyone. And the person said that you have to be a good Muslim, a good Hindu, a good Christian to have the dialogue. If you're apologetic about who you are, that's not real dialogue. So if a historian is apologetic by what they are, then they can't really do history, right? So yes, there's something to learn from anthropology. Limited, perhaps. There's something to learn from political science, again, in a limited way. But a historian needs to be a historian because there are clear and important methodological differences between these disciplines. And while a conversation is important, losing sight of who you are will actually not do service to the discipline. And the people who know me know I can go on a long rant about some disciplines, but I shall just highlight the point and leave it there. The fourth thing that I really want to talk about, that this relates to the third point, is that a lot of the questions that we ask in history, we ask because they sound right, but you've never really understood or actually tried to understand why they sound right, right? I'll give you one example here, and just to illustrate the point. Dr. Pashura Singh very importantly spoke about power dynamics. And this is something that a historian always grapples with because, again, the old adage that history is written by the winners. Now, the question is, yes, of course, it's written by the winners, not the losers. But when the losers write history, is it equally important as what the winners wrote? Don't at times ask this question at all, because we just think, let's talk about that small man, that's great. But why? It adds to our knowledge, yes. It gives a different dimension, yes. And then what? So yes, we need to interrogate questions of power, but how we interrogate questions of power is a very important methodological question that we don't really look at. I kind of annoyed a Regus professor of history at Oxford, Professor Lyndon Roper, a few years ago, because she wrote about the life of a common man in 16th century France. And I read the book and I said, so what? Well, it's nice, but did this person affect the way the French government ran? Did this person affect the way French society was being shaped? Yes, it's very interesting in what the person is actually, but so what? That so what question will actually help us understand the power dynamics in a better framework. So I think even when you're asking these questions, I think those boundaries need to be pushed so that we can really kind of understand and take these things in. Related to that is also the question, and especially here, I want to focus on the question of regional history, that you cannot study anything in a silo also. And that's a very, very important point. So let's say we want to focus on Lyallpur. We just can't ignore what's happening around the world at this time when this colony is being set up, even 150 years ago, even today. And here again, we are flashed with things from political science and regional studies and other places about things like globalization and all that. And here I always remember, again, very seminal work of people like John Darwin, who wrote this excellent book called After Tamerlane, which basically showed how the world was connected in 1400. Then, of course, the more recent work that I'm quite sure a lot of you would have heard about is Peter Frankopan's about the Silk World, the Silk Routes. The world was a lot more connected 500, 600, 700 years ago, but in different ways, right? And that connectivity one must not forget. I always, I teach a course on Lahore, and my students always get shocked when I tell them that in the 1400s, there was an Armenian colony in Lahore, because there were so many Armenian traders that they had set up a colony. And if you know Lahore, it was right behind where the UET is now. Again, no one would have seen an Armenian in cosmopolitan Lahore today, and probably, actually, we don't even have diplomatic relations with Armenia in the very strange turn of events. So things were global way before the word global perhaps existed in that framework. So we need to understand that there's this continuous conversation that has been going on. And again, a historian, if they are true to their discipline, will figure it out much quicker than the other new things that are coming in, because they're looking more towards the present. And that's also very important, which again leads to another very interesting E.H. Carr quote, which is, let me just bring that. The function of the historian is neither to love the past, nor to emancipate himself from the past, but to master and understand it as the key to the understanding of the present. So this is, again, a very, very important framework that I think one needs to understand. A lot of the times, and I think, again, at this conference, we've looked back at the past and said, oh, how wonderful. Some of it was really bad, actually. For once, most of the women who are here would not have been here. So thankfully, something's changed, and that's happened. A lot of other things would have been very different too. So one should not just be in love with the past and how it's understood, but see this as a dynamic conversation where things are changing, things keep going forward and back, and those methodologies really need to be front and center about it. The last thing which I really want to talk about, and that will lead to Dr. Virdee's conversation, because she's done, I don't know if she's going to mention it, so I should at least, that she's done an excellent paper on oral history. And I hope she will talk about it, because that oral history paper, again, challenged the ways, and she's one of the first persons who actually did oral history in terms of the Punjab. And that, again, challenged a lot of the received knowledge on oral history. Because, again, it's very nice to hear कि बूढ़े लोग कहानी आपको क्या सुना रहे हैं. But what's beyond the kahani is the really important bit. How do you understand this? Are you fetishizing a lot of the past? Are you fetishizing a lot of the narratives that are being given to you? These are very important and critical. And again, what we have taken from some other disciplines in history is, oral history is great because you go speak to a person and you write their kahani, and it's so brilliant. Well, it's lazy, because you have to do a lot of work around it for it to make sense. And it always reminds me of my PhD supervisor, Professor Judith Brown, who was very much against oral history till all of this is done. And she said, you can only use it once you've done all the groundwork around it, or else you won't be able to understand it. So again, a lot of the fads now today are really good and great, and methodologically, we all love using those new keywords. I decide not to and be a bit unpopular about it. But I think, again, the last word on this is we can understand the region, the country, the globe only better if historians act like one, and also be open to the questions that the continuous, that's one of the, again, an anecdote, but I think it illustrates the point. I'm sure a lot of you here have studied political science, or at least taken some classes in it. I used to work at Oxford University Press and used to have this joke that, in political science, because you get everything wrong, there is a new edition every 2 or 3 years. In history, there isn't, because once you have interpreted how things have happened, very rarely you'll revise it dramatically. But in political science, you'll keep doing it. And that's a very important methodological difference between the disciplines. And I think, therefore, really trying to use that lens that has been there for centuries and has actually stood the test of time is really important. And I think all the new things that have coming in, if those are engaged with looking at these earlier ways in which we did history, will make not only the discipline better, but be able to help us understand our present better, because that's the main point of the historian, to understand what's happening at the present through the prism of the past. So just some ideas, and I hope we can have a good discussion afterwards too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bangesh. Now I will request Professor Dr. Pippa Virdee from De Montfort University, Leicester, UK.
Thank you, Professor Singh, and thank you, Dr. Bangesh. I would differ with some of the things that he's just said.
Sure.
And I think that was the point. And I think one of the things that, which is the last point that you made about the past, that once it's written, it's written. But actually, I would argue that every generation rewrites that past. And that is why history is always written in the present. It's about the past, but it's written in the present because every generation reinterprets that past. And I think it's right that we do that, which is partly why and we've heard this kind of mentioned, Pashura Singh mentioned this, it was mentioned yesterday as well, in terms of the kind of decolonizing agenda, which I think has been far more prevalent in the West than it has in the global South, but I think it has relevance here because obviously it affects us. But I suppose if we kind of flip it, is how do we apply that agenda to the study of our own societies? within our own societies, as opposed to you know, in the West, where, of course, what it's meant is that it's excluded many minority histories, and how do we incorporate that into mainstream histories? I suppose I've got a few points I want to make, and I'll try to keep them as brief as possible. But Yaqoob was right in the sense that in kind of recent years, I've been sort of exploring more the kind of history and the relationship it has with new technologies. And I think that's really kind of important, because the kind of new technologies and social media and the ways in which we share history has really kind of changed. And on the one hand, what has happened, it has opened up that whole spectrum, and it's allowed lots of people to kind of engage, to kind of create their own histories and to contribute to our kind of understanding of the past. But at the same time, actually, and here I would differ with you slightly in that I think whilst there's that positive aspect to it, but what particularly in sort of bringing about sort of local, regional histories, what has happened is perhaps what you were alluding to, which is about the kind of pureness of the trained professional historian. So how we deal with those things as opposed to the layman or the amateur or the person who runs an Instagram page, for example. So how do they approach history as opposed to a professional historian? So I'm going to elaborate on three things, which are language, gender, and class. And just to kind of highlight some of the kind of challenges, and I'm talking particularly in respect to my own work, which has been on oral history, and especially partition. And I think one of the ways in which you start to notice the importance of language is the ways in which, say, we collect oral histories, and if you see that there's a dominance of Urdu, Hindi, or English accounts, this essentially then means that you're excluding a lot of regional, local languages. And so if we want to try to then kind of open up the field, then we really need to see the importance that language plays, because of course oral history rests on the primacy of the spoken word as opposed to the written document. So language, and especially kind of regional languages, and being able to convey these histories in regional languages, I think it's really kind of important. Otherwise, what we gather is very limited in terms of that kind of material. And I suppose the other side of that then is that it continues to reinforce the dominance of those majority languages. And again, the kind of, the nuances that you would capture in local dialects tends to be lost. And over a period of time, you then find that those associated histories also will be lost. So I think that's kind of really important in terms of, looking at the role of language and history. Secondly, looking at the issue of gender, I think, as again, Dr. Bangesh has just kind of pointed out, often history is written about the kind of the winners. In the past, this has been mostly focused on men. How do we begin to shift this? Because, we've made a lot of inroads. There's been a lot of sort of, other histories that have come, and important histories that have emerged, and the role that women play, whether it's in the background or whether actually they have been in the forefront, but not spoken about. And often it is about excavating those hidden histories and making very clear the role of those women. But other than just kind of women, I think what we also have to kind of recognize is that this is also a question of gender and kind of bringing in those kind of diverse perspectives. And the only way we can bring that diversity, whether it's regionally, nationally, or even globally, is through the inclusion and participation of having a greater diversity in terms of your scholars, of your universities employing people who come from more diverse backgrounds, because they are the ones then who are producing this new knowledge. And if the knowledge producers come from a very limited group of people, then the knowledge produced is also going to be very limited. So I think that's one thing. And I think here, if I just put on my kind of head of department role, I think this is where, departmental heads can play a very important role in terms of recruitment and ensuring that they are giving opportunities to a greater diversity of people, and therefore bringing more diverse perspectives into history. And I think the kind of challenge here is that, we really need to then ask these critical questions, because unless we're able to ask difficult questions without reproach, there's a danger that we keep reproducing the kind of status quo, or we keep reproducing those majoritarian narratives or state narratives. And we have to kind of create an environment, a safe environment in which we can ask these difficult questions. And I think that's a really kind of an important question for us historians, because I think sometimes we can be in the kind of danger of just kind of reproducing state propaganda, and we have to be able to kind of produce objective histories. The kind of final point really is about class, and I suppose here, although the kind of subaltern study school has made sort of, it has made major contributions, it has its kind of limitations, but it hasn't really, had that kind of revolutionary change that we hoped. It was very prominent in the 1980s and to some extent 1990s, but it has somewhat sort of dissipated. And despite the fact that oral history was supposed to offer a voice to the voiceless, especially those excluded from the mainstream, I think history, what it hasn't been able to do, oral history hasn't been able to kind of challenge that sufficiently. And I think particularly in respect to South Asia, and here I kind of use the example of partition, where there's still a tendency to talk about, to focus on those who are able to articulate things and those who are willing to speak. And those who aren't able to articulate, or perhaps don't willingly want to share these things, feel that their voices aren't captured. And so what we end up doing is we reproduce the same kind of voices. And often that reproduction happens in the same sort of, reproduces our own biases in many ways. Because if we're going to be seeking people from our own kind of network, it has sometimes, there is a danger that you will reproduce those biases. So it's very kind of important that we are mindful of these things, and particularly reflecting on them in our own projects. So I suppose the thing is that when we design our projects, or our research projects, we should be mindful of these questions, thinking about our own positionality as insiders and outsiders, of the kind of choices we're making in terms of which language we choose to conduct those interviews, and where you're conducting the interview, how you're gathering those people, what is your objective, and that kind of, and this is the kind of point I was making initially, that this is where the professional historian must differ from the kind of the layman or the amateur. And I'll leave you with one story, which is of an interview I conducted over 10 years ago. And I think it captures all these three things very poignantly. And it was an interview which I did in the walled city in Lahore. It was with a woman who had migrated from Firozpur, came to Lahore. And, you know, these are subaltern voices. And I was with her, and I wanted her to kind of share her experiences. And she just looked at me and she says, "Minnu ta kuch pata nahi hai. मैं की थानू दसा मेरा भाई इत्थे बैठा तुसी ओनू पूछ लो." And I said to her, no, you know, I want to, whatever you want to share with me, I want to hear your perspective. You know, it doesn't matter how little that is. And here she's, you know, denying her own sort of experiences, big or small, and saying, "Speak to my brother." And so we continue, I persevere, and she does begin to open up. But every now and then you could hear the brother muttering in the background. And one of the things he said to me was, or said in the background was, "Hun minnu ta permission nahi hegi bolan nu, nahi ta main ta inna nu sara kuch das sakda siga." Right? And these kind of, you know, interactions, which are not part of the formal sort of account, but you kind of pick up in that environment and you learn to sort of read between those kind of conversations and understand the kind of dynamics that are at play here about the kind of dominance of certain voices and the way in which women suppress their own experiences. I think for me that stayed with me and is a very important one in terms of bringing language, class and gender together. So I think I've spoken too much, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Virdee. That was great. Now I will request Professor Perviz Vandal of National College of Arts, Lahore. You are on.
Assalamu alaikum, good morning, Sat Sri Akal. But before I start, I think I would like to ask the hard taskmaster, how much time do I have? Okay, thank you so much. That means I have some leeway that I can talk about now. I'm a little different person from all of you because I'm an architect. And the reason that I'm sitting here is perhaps that we and I have been talking about history of architecture and what about that one. So while of course there is a similarity there and there is a combination there, it is there. But really before I go on, I think the fact that this history conference is taking place in Lyallpur, which was at one time considered backwaters, you know, so this is a tremendous effort, and I think we have to owe a great amount of gratitude to the Chattha Chiba combination, which has brought about this particular place. And like all history conferences, you know, one makes discoveries. And one of my greatest players has been here to find and to discover one Mr. Musaddaq Zulkarnain. And I mean, I'm not saying it offhand. I didn't realize that we share a whole lot of things. I mean, of course, I'm much more senior, but we did go to Hassan Abdal, so that's our beginning point. And that makes me very happy because all of you who may be familiar with Hassan Abdal, it's famous for producing generals and civil servants. Now, the less I say about generals, the better. I mean, I better not say too much. But it is such a pleasure to see Hassan Abdal producing somebody like him. I mean, a gentleman who is interested, genuinely interested in literature, in history. I mean, that's not true. I mean, you can't do that. That's not fair to Hassan Abdal, I mean. So, so it's a real source of great pleasure, and I'm really very happy that this... Coming down to the question of history of architecture, it runs parallel to, you know, the Pakistan came about, and right away the question of identity. And as you would please appreciate that architecture, these monuments are living symbols and propaganda tools, and they become the symbols and what you adopt. So what is Pakistan's identity? I mean, Pakistani architecture daso ki hunda. So I said, I mean, you know, like, I remember came back from my studies, one of the first things was we were hit in 1965, 66. Most of you were not born then. But this is the question which hit us. What is Pakistani architecture? And like we were young students, and we didn't question it. Yes, of course, there must be some Pakistani architecture. And we began to look for it. And, you know, we suddenly find out that the government of Pakistan is sort of organizing seminars. And they decided that, of course, we have Pakistan, it came on Islam, and then they began to talk of the similarity of Pakistan architecture being Islamic architecture. And there were 3 seminars held in 66, 67, 68. I participated in 2 of them way early on. And while at that seminar, we began to ask, is it Islamic architecture that the Muslims built, or the thing? And is all Pakistanis Muslim? And what about the Sikhs and the Hindus? So the questions were raised, but of course we were shut up. You know what I mean? So we kept quiet and we came along. And then when you began to teach architecture and you get to teaching of history of architecture, now how much can you cover up? You can't. Of course, history speaks up. When you go around Lahore, I know all the books talk of only the architecture of Lahore, and I know all of you talk of the Badshai Mosque and the fort and the Wazir Khan Mosque. But what about the great temples of the place in Lahore? The great Gurdwaras, the fire temples of the Parsis. And there were other people there. But we seem to forget, and that reminds exactly what the doctor was saying, silence. And I remember that very clearly, that when we, by sheer somehow discovering, we found that there was a gentleman called Bhai Ram Singh, who actually designed all of Lahore, and not Gangaram. So Bhai Ram Singh, and he happened to be a Sikh, and he happened to be a carpenter from the carpenter's family, and he came, and sheer genius, he dominated everything, and he became the best. And I remember I thought this was a great work that my wife Saida and I, we did it together, author, and we thought that we'd get a good response. And you know the response we got? Oh, yaar, Musalman isi kar baya. So, I mean, all one could say is that, yaar, Musalman ne koi kaam kita ho to suda bhi kar denge. I mean, it is not a question of mazhab or something, it's a question of the work done. Now, what I mean is that quickly, this particular process brought us down to the fact that perhaps this slogan of one country, one book, and one language, or which one, perhaps it's not quite working. And very soon we realize, for example, today, the situation is that a metric pass or a 12 years, now this young person who's passed all his examinations, but he can't write in Punjabi, he can't write in Urdu, he can't write in English. So this Punjab of ours today, the West one, is the only people I know in the world who have no language anymore. Thank you very much. So we have no language. We can't write, we can't see. Now this is like where we were hit that this is just not the way to do something. And we obviously began to talk of, and I've lately been talking about Punjab architecture. The regional study is the only way out to understand these varieties. When you look at Pakistan, it's a great country, right from the north to south, with a variety. I mean, Hunza and Gilgit, Swat and Swabis, and Pothohar, Punjab, Cholistan, Shergard, Sindh, Maritime, all, they're not the same. They are part of the country. There's no doubt about that. But the architecture is as varied as you can. And this brings into focus what we've been talking about, that ultimately is the study of the parts which make up the whole, the famous thing. And that is, I mean, I'll talk about it later in my paper, in the question of how regional approach is perhaps the only approach where we can understand and appreciate and value and understand that all are people. And we must look when we travel, and we must travel, I think, if you want to understand architecture, that in addition to the Badshai Mosque, in order to that, there is the Gurdwaras there, There are the temples there. They may be defaced, I do not know. But the defacing, we have experts at. Bhutto Sahab ne, when he had this second, the Islamic summit, and he had this wonderful thing done in the Cherry Cross. Now go and see the situation of that place now. It's deserted, it is mesmerized, it is wrong. Now this thing happens, I know the change of governments and all that. But the reality is that if you are going to study and put down the facts together, you have to look at all the parts and the regional parts. And you have to travel to understand with your eyes and ears and all everything very open and open to understand that you cannot start a discovery with the mind already made up. You have to start off with a certain open mind to proceed. And then you see the pleasures of discovery and you find friends all around and you find really genuine peace and happiness to see, yes, we were not a single-minded people. We had a variety of people living together, and that is the way the real pleasure and enjoyment of Pakistan is. Thank you so much.
We would like to take few questions from the audience with permission of the chair, Dr. Pashura Singh.
I would like to take the issue of objective historiography. When we were studying, we were told that objective writing is like a process that we see in performing an autopsy of a dead body. You report what you actually see. You cannot add or subtract anything from what you have seen. So objective history is just write what you see, observe, and then that is the true objective history. Now we are questioning, that objective history is not possible. The person who is performing an autopsy may have his own subjective agenda at that moment. So maybe Dr. Bangesh, you can add on this issue of objective history.
We will take just 2 questions, precise questions, please. No comments.
Hello, Assalamualaikum. I'm Alia Hadi Ali. I have a question for Dr. Bangesh. You were explaining about the few of the females ended up here because the history have somewhat, acknowledged us to be females and to end up here. And as far as excavations were done, the figurines were never male which were excavated. They were always females. And we females, it's not about feminism I'm talking about, but it's about that we never end places accidentally. We are there in history, we are there in artworks, we are there in every part of whatever is done, because we were the one who were the homemakers. We were the one at the back who, if there is a brick or there is a clay pot, we are the one who was keeping that. So I was a bit, moved by this concept from such an, amazing writer and a concept maker at this type of a platform. We don't end up at places. We develop because we are, biologically, we develop. हम बनाती हैं, हमें बनाया इसी तरीके से गया है. So it will be very nice if a historian start acknowledging things in a more broader spectrum of rather making us...
So can you please tell us what is your question exactly?
The question is that you have to be very confined when you are confined the status of a male and female when it is coming towards the history. How do you confine the status of both by balancing them in history? This is my question.
Hello, thank you for the very, very wonderful panel. Really enjoyed it. And I want to also speak to Dr. Bangesh about challenging the idea of what's so what. And I just wanted to suggest that to truly understand 16th century France, if you only understand the king and the nobles and the elites, you have no idea the impact of what they're doing, right? So I don't think I think that a common person from 16th century France has much to tell us about France as the king. And so I just want to challenge you a little bit on that and ask you to reconsider perhaps that the so what question can be construed perhaps in broader terms.
So,
Thank you.
last question we are
Yes,
taking for
yes.
this panel.
Thank you. My question is from Dr. Bangesh, as she was saying, that only the elite class can impact the society. But as you can see that Dr. Pippa Virdee has already worked on the people's history and she is working on it, don't you think it will impact on the overall society? And then there is one more question. Can we be objective being an historian? This is my question. Can we be objective? I don't think so. We are very much stuck to our statement, whatever we have made to do our work. And I think in this regard, I will appreciate Tibri's things which he was writing, only the incidents he was writing, and he was giving us just the things that this person has said, this person has said. So when we go into the interpretation, I think we are very much biased. So this is my question, how we can be objective? Thank you.
Great. So I think the provocations worked. And that was the whole point. And I should say we had a conversation of what we're going to kind of say. But let me just take it from the first audience question. I think as Dr. Virdee was actually saying that one of the main things is that, because most of the people who wrote history were men, they just kind of ignored women. So it's not that women didn't do anything, it's just that they were just ignored. And therefore, we do not have narratives of women. And women's histories and how they are. And even when they are very clouded by certain ways in which women were understood to behave, and and that is now changing. And Dr. Virdee was actually talking about that. So I think that was the context of talking about women. Now, how do we deal with that? I think that's a very, very important question because, again, and that talks to the other point. Again, the point about the 17th century France thing was that it needs to go beyond just a description of it. It needs to go beyond and to make that kind of connection and saying, well, how does it actually speak to us? And I think that's the question that, some people, for example, would focus so much on women's history, then they'll forget the men. So you need both because both of them do exist. And I think that is where, again, if you're very careful about how you are doing history, and I think I'll re-emphasize what Pippa actually said, there has to be a difference between an Instagram account and a historian. And I think that is where that comes in, that you take all of these things into consideration, what's happening. As Professor Vandal said, that there was a time that Lyallpur was considered a backwaters, but was it a backwaters? There were things happening here. We were just discussing this other day, that out of the 3 cities in the Punjab where the name changed, Campbellpur, Montgomery, and Lyallpur, in Lyallpur is the only place where it's been rehabilitated to a large extent. Now the common man kind of knows the name. Of course, much to the Chathachima combine, but other people have actually kind of worked with that. And I think that's the important bit where what is considered backwaters was not really the backwaters. And, those kind of explorations are really important. But again, the historian has to be, and this connects to the objective question, while I don't think anyone can be objective, completely, you just have to be aware of how biased you are and kind of bring it down a notch or two. I think that's the only carefulness. When I teach the history of Pakistan, I always begin with the example in saying every country makes up a bit of its history. Every country. Like, you go to the US, no one's going to teach you that we killed so many Native Americans. That's not going to be taught in grade 3. Once you reach a certain level, you'll figure it out. You'll know this. But, people in the US still celebrate Thanksgiving as a Thanksgiving thing. And, once you read the history of the whole thing, you're like, wow, why are they celebrating this? So they make it up. The French make it up. The British make it up. We make it up. The difference is that, how much you make it up. In Pakistan, at times, we get terribly excited and make up about 80 to 90% of it. 10, 15% is perhaps, the average that one can live with. And I think that's where objectivity kind of comes in. That's where training and discipline, what I was talking about, one needs to be really careful about the discipline. That's where it comes in, because it kind of, as Dr. Pashura Singh actually said, if you treat it to an extent like an autopsy, then even though you'll be biased because, you have certain frames of mind, it will kind of, keep coming down the percentage. So I think there is no clear and simple answer on how to lessen bias and increase objectivity. I think it's more about awareness and more about, as I said, that quote from E.H. Carr is great, study the historian, because you have your own biases, and if the historian studies themselves first, that might be a way of actually being slightly more objective. Can never be completely objective, but slightly more. And I think slightly more kar karke, you might reach a stage where it's, reasonably okay. But never 100% on either side. But I think the whole point of, as I said earlier also, a lot of what I was saying is not exactly what I believe, but I think those are the provocations one must kind of bring in. Because unless we think about these things, we just assume a lot of things. And I think those assumptions really need to be continually challenged and reworked and reframed.
Can I add something?
Yes.
If you don't mind. I mean, just continuing with Dr. Bangesh said, but also, yeah, a little different, because specifically not worried too much about Europe or whatever, but specifically in Pakistan, just to focus here, the question is that we now know that there is something called the official narrative. Now you can find it in textbooks, and you can find in what is being taught to the students, and that's the official version. And we know that by now, anybody who knows a little bit, we can know that official version is not quite correct. And you see, when general public, so to say, by the reader, begin to lose confidence in the official narrative, I think that's bad news. But that becomes a split between what is a reality and what somebody wants you to believe. Now, this kind of system, when it happens, professional historians are equally part of developing this kind of official narratives and not questioning it. And I'm talking about Pakistan. I'm not talking about any other country here. And we have here K.K. Aziz, who actually we know that history as being taught was distortion of history. So this is the only thing I want to add here, that this act here in Pakistan has taken on an acute dimension of the official history as opposed to the real history. And again, I think perhaps the regional approach to history is the only one which will bring us all together, the official narrative and this one. And this is where Lyallpur History Society has begun an issue which is a step in the right direction, and therefore, if anybody has any influence in any other city, we should encourage people to write about their own cities and write about their own particular experiences. And that cumulative history is exactly then will give us shape, hopefully, to what we are looking at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, our chair, Professor Dr. Pashura Singh, for chairing this session. Thank you so much, all the panelists, for being here and for sharing wonderful information with us.
My new book is coming, maybe.
So I would like to take a moment to introduce a recently published book by Professor Dr. Pashura Singh, The Routledge Companion to the Life and Legacy of Guru Har Gobind, Sovereignty, Militancy and Empowerment of the Sikh Panth. The book reconstructs the life of Guru Har Gobind Ji by exploring the divine presence in history and memory. It addresses the questions of why and how militancy became explicit during Guru Har Gobind Singh Ji's spiritual reign. It is a very unique contribution. This book provides a multidisciplinary paradigm in the reconstruction of Guru Har Gobind's life and legacy.